The suburban explosion of home building in southeast Fairfax County and along Route 1 was in full swing. Route 1 was just chock full of gas stations and restaurants and fast food places. But one of them captured a lot of the old-timey feeling along Route 1, and that was the Dixie Pig. And for years it was the hangout for high school kids, and families went there. It was a wonderful restaurant. Another interesting spot was the Mount Vernon Drive-In movie theater. It was the first one in the Washington, D.C. area. You'd hook up a speaker to your window of the car and you'd watch the movie, and at intermission you'd go get some popcorn. And it was closed in the 1980s, torn down to make room for a regular old Cineplex. And most recently, it became the site, that was torn down also, it became the site of the Costco on Route 1. Another location along the Route 1 corridor, or as many people call it, the Richmond Highway corridor, is the Montebello condominiums. It was the site of a very famous house, which belonged to a very famous person, and that was Brian Fairfax. And Brian was the 8th Lord Fairfax. And his home was called Mount Eagle, and it was up there on that big hill. And it was a private residence after that for years, and some developers turned it into a country club. And it was torn down to make way for the Montebello condominiums in the late 60s, early 70s.
Fort Hunt Route 1 corridor over here has always been sort of a unique, isolated place from the rest of the county. And I think, you know, the history and the natural assets, the proximity to the Potomac, it's just made it a really attractive area that a lot of people want to live in and want to come back to. The Huntington area, where the Huntington Metro Station is actually a bunch of series of Civil War forts back in the 1850s. You get up to the Pendaw area, it's named for an old hotel. I think it was opened back in the 30s. Right by the Krispy Kreme, it's one of the oldest Krispy Kremes in the United States. And then you go up the hill, you get to Beacon Hill, which is one of the highest pieces of real estate in Fairfax County. Then you go down the hill, that gets you into Hybla Valley. It's also an historic part of the county. George Mason's son owned a house that overlooked Hybla Valley. And you go a little bit further south, you hit Gum Springs, of course, which is the oldest historically black community in Fairfax County, founded by one of George Washington's former slaves.
In the 1870s, the community had an interesting organization called the Joint Stock Club. The deacons and the pastor of the church, they got together, formed this club, whereby they purchased property in the community and they sold it at cost. They were not concerned about profit, they were concerned about building a community.
Along Route 1 during the 1960s, the residents suffered from the turmoil associated with desegregating Virginia schools. And that was particularly acute in the Gum Springs area of the Route 1 corridor.
I can remember as a child looking down at the school, and there was always something going on here. Secondary school, you had to go to Manassas. And of course, we didn't have the road system that we now have. People had to get up 4 and 5 o'clock to start out for their education. Gum Springs, Woodlawn, and Mount Vernon are the 3 oldest elements in the area. And as the area started to evolve and develop, Gum Springs was beginning to be left behind. I think it's important for people to realize, even with the depiction of the shacks that were in Gum Springs, there were also these Cape Cods that were in the community. Some of the homeowners, they got together with the Action Association, the federal government, and Jude Shriver to build the Spring Garden Apartments. And I look at that as a continuation of the Joint Stock Club.
Well, despite the density of business enterprises along Route 1, things began to change in the 1960s and 70s. And it's ironic that the change came from other roads. The first was Shirley Highway, and that took a lot of the through traffic away from Route 1. The Beltway opened in early 60s that added to this issue. So all of a sudden in the mid-70s, the Route 1 corridor was full of gas stations that nobody used anymore, and motels that nobody stopped in. And that's when things began to change in the community.
Southeast Fairfax Development Corporation, SFDC, was founded in 1981 to help with the revitalization and economic development in the corridor. We market the corridor to developers, to retailers, to different businesses. We try to grow our own businesses. We also work with developers and property owners to try to find assemblages of property that they could perhaps develop. And we work with civic organizations and residents on the highway.
Jerry Hyland was elected supervisor at a really important time of transition in our community. And there was a hugely divisive school merger when they merged Fort Hunt High School and Groveton High School together. And Jerry was elected right on the tail end of that. Communities tend to be oriented around their schools, and these high schools tend to be really significant community institutions. And Mount Vernon is one of the oldest in the county, and their band, they wear three-corner hats and call themselves the Majors. I mean, they're very proud of their history there.
The opening of the Fairfax County Parkway eased the access to Fort Belvoir. It also allowed folks in the Mount Vernon area to go out to their jobs at Tyson's Corner. It made it much easier. When the Base Realignment and Closure Commission moved a lot of facilities and installations to Fort Belvoir, that created a great strain on Route 1's traffic capacity.
Fort Belvoir actually employs about 40,000 people. For some perspective, the Pentagon employs about 23,000. And so Congressman Jim Moran sort of led the charge in securing a federal earmark to fund a $180 million widening from Telegraph Road up to Jeff Todd Way, where the Roy Rogers is, right near the Woodlawn Estate.
Several years ago, SFDC and the Community Appearance Committee, volunteers, worked with the county, and they created beautified areas in the medians. We have gateway signs at each of our CBCs, Community Business Centers. And we also have some destination signs along the highway that tell you how many miles until you reach Woodlawn, for example.
Woodlawn was built in 1805. George Washington gave it to his step-granddaughter, Nellie Custis. This house was designed by the architect of the Capitol, but like many other large tracts of land in Virginia, it was a slave plantation. About 40 years later, the Lewis family sold the property, and the buyers were abolitionist Quakers from Pennsylvania and from New Jersey. They were after the old growth trees that were on the property. That's why it was called Woodlawn, because they were building clipper ships. But when they came down here, they also saw that there was a real blow that they could strike in favor of abolitionism. They wanted to prove to the rest of the South that you could have a profitable farm without slave labor, and they did it. Arcadia's mission is to create a more equitable and sustainable local food system. Equitable means everybody has access to the good stuff and that it's affordable. And sustainable means it's grown using methods that are kind to the earth, kind to the wildlife, kind to the pollinators, that build soil fertility, and also sustainable for local farmers. Farmers have to be able to make money or they're not going to keep growing food. We've been on the property for about 5 years, and the piece that we think is really exciting is that this property has a history of using food and agriculture in pursuit of social justice. And there's another great connection with Nellie to us, and that is she was a star entertainer and very focused on food. And so we're growing food in her old kitchen garden and sort of once again returning those grounds to its historic roots. And we're working with the staff of the property and with the National Trust to reimagine ways of interpreting the site. It has always been about the house and the incredible architecture, but now we're going to be working in and the incredible agricultural experience here as well.